Break through the white noise and see the world through a prism of intense color and raw emotion. We redefine digital storytelling by showing you every shade of the human experience. Click subscribe now and start seeing the world in a whole new light.
I was watering my grandmother's garden when my phone buzzed on the porch railing. I almost didn't check it. It was a Saturday morning in late October, the kind that smells like wood smoke and cold soil. And I was elbow deep in pulling dead marigolds before the first hard frost. My grandmother, Eleanor, was sitting in her chair by the kitchen window the way she always did on weekend mornings, watching me work, occasionally tapping on the glass to point out a weed I'd missed. She was 81 and had survived a hip replacement, 2 floods, and 40 years of marriage to a man who thought budgeting was something other people did. She was sharp as a tack, and she knew it. My phone buzzed again. Then a third time. I pulled off my gloves, walked up the porch steps, and picked it up. The messages were from my brother. "Hey, just so you know, me and Dana are moving to Scottsdale. Flying out tomorrow morning. We went ahead and used the account. Grandma won't need all of it anyway. Don't make this into a whole thing." I read them twice. Then I sat down on the porch steps and read them a third time. The account he was referring to was not just some family savings fund. It was the estate account my grandmother had set up after my grandfather died. A structured account tied to the house, the small rental property on Birchwood Street, and a cash reserve she had spent decades building so that her end-of-life care would never fall on me or my brother's shoulders. She'd been meticulous about it. She had a binder, color-coded tabs. She had shown it to both of us the year she turned 78, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, saying, "I want you both to understand exactly what this is and exactly what it is not. It is not spending money. It is not a safety net for your problems. It is mine." My brother had nodded and said, "Of course, Grandma." I set my phone face down on the step. Then I picked it up again and called my cousin Reese. Reese answered on the second ring, already sounding like she knew something was wrong. She has always been like that, a kind of emotional barometric pressure sensor. We had grown up on the same street, been each other's person through every hard thing. And she was the one I had called 2 years ago when I first noticed my brother's behavior starting to shift. The requests for small loans that were never repaid. The way he talked about my grandmother's house as if he were already calculating its resale value. The comments at Christmas about how it was a shame to have so much sitting there doing nothing. "He did it," I said when she picked up. A pause. "How much?" "I don't know yet. He says they're moving to Scottsdale, flying out tomorrow." Another pause, longer this time. "Okay," she said. "Call the bank first. Call me back after. I want to explain something about my brother before I go further, because the story is not really about a villain. It is about something slower and sadder than that. The way entitlement calcifies in a person over years until they genuinely cannot see the line between what is theirs and what is not. My brother is 3 years older than me. His name is Marcus. He married Dana 7 years ago, and she is lovely in the way that a house can look lovely from the street while the pipes are quietly failing inside. Together, they had built a life that was always slightly beyond their means, always requiring just a little more runway, always one good break away from stability. And every time that break didn't come, they looked around for something to lean on. For the last 5 years, what they had been leaning on was the idea of my grandmother's estate, not the reality of it. The idea. The vague, unspoken assumption that when the time came, there would be enough, that the numbers in that account were somehow earmarked for the family in a general sense. That family included Marcus's mortgage and Dana's wellness retreats and the lease on a car that neither of them could afford without help. They had never said this explicitly, but they had implied it in 100 small ways. The way Marcus would mention the Birchwood rental property in conversations about his financial stress, like it was a resource he was temporarily unable to access. The way Dana had once asked me, with what seemed like genuine curiosity, whether I thought my grandmother had updated her plans recently. I had never confronted them directly about it. I want to be honest about that. I had told myself it was because I didn't have proof, because I didn't want to cause drama, because my grandmother was healthy and there was no urgency. But the truth is that I had been afraid of what confirmation would feel like. Some part of me had been hoping I was wrong about who my brother had become. I was not wrong. When I called the bank that Saturday morning, the woman on the phone was professional and careful with her words. She confirmed that a withdrawal had been processed the previous afternoon. It was significant. Not the entirety of the account, but enough to matter, enough to hurt. The authorization had gone through because Marcus was listed as a secondary account holder, a designation my grandmother had added years ago for emergency purposes, for the practical scenario of being incapacitated and needing someone to handle urgent bills. He had used it to wire money to a joint account in his and Dana's names. I thanked the woman and hung up. I sat in my car in my grandmother's driveway for a few minutes before going back inside. I needed to decide how I was going to tell her. She deserved to know. But I also knew what it would do to her. Not financially, because we would figure that out. But the other thing. The thing that doesn't have a clean name. The recognition that your child looked at something you built with 40 years of careful, unglamorous work and decided it was theirs to take. I went back inside. She was still at the window. "You've got your thinking face on," she said without turning around. "I need to tell you something." She turned then. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, "Is it Marcus?" I hadn't expected that. "You knew?" "I didn't know," she said carefully. "But I noticed. He asked me twice in the last month if I'd ever considered adding Dana to the account too. I told him no. He seemed unsatisfied with that answer." She folded her hands in her lap. "Tell me what happened." I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I have always loved about her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "How much?" I told her. She nodded slowly. Then she said, "Call Daniel." Daniel was her attorney. She had his number memorized. I want to be very clear about what happened next, because I've seen versions of the story where the person who gets taken from becomes a passive victim waiting for resolution to find them. My grandmother was not that person. She had Daniel on the phone within the hour, and by that afternoon, she had a clear picture of what her legal options were. Marcus had been a secondary account holder with technically valid authorization. This made immediate criminal charges complicated, but not impossible, depending on the terms of the account agreement and whether there was documentation of the account's intended purpose. Daniel was careful with his language, but he was also direct. If he boards that plane tomorrow, this gets harder. Not impossible, but harder. My grandmother looked at me across the kitchen table and said, "Then he doesn't board that plane. I'm going to tell you what I did, and I'm going to tell it to you plainly, because the whole thing was less dramatic in the doing than it sounds." I texted Marcus back. I kept my message short. I told him that I knew what he had done, that I had spoken to Daniel, and that there were significant legal questions about the authorization that would need to be resolved before any of us could move forward. I told him that the smartest thing he could do was call me before 9 o'clock that evening. He didn't call. He texted instead. "This is insane. We talked about this. Grandma is fine. You're being dramatic." I did not respond to that message. At 7:43 the next morning, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. The voicemail was Dana. She sounded different from her usual self, clipped, a little breathless, like someone trying very hard to sound calm. She said that they had arrived in Scottsdale and were getting settled, and that there must have been some misunderstanding about the account, and that they were sure we could work it out as a family. I listened to it twice, and then I called Daniel. Here's what I had not told Marcus in my text, because I had been advised not to. In the weeks before this, in the month when Marcus had been asking my grandmother about adding Dana to the account, in the month I had been trying to convince myself I was reading too much into things, I had quietly done something practical. I had spoken with Daniel myself. I had asked him to walk me through the account structure, the authorization terms, and what protections existed. He had pointed out something significant. The secondary authorization had been granted for emergency management of routine bills, and there was clear documentation of this in the original account agreement. A wire transfer of this size to a personal joint account agreement. A wire transfer of this size to a personal joint account was not a routine bill. It was not within the scope of what the authorization covered. This didn't guarantee anything. Legal processes are slow and expensive and exhausting, and my grandmother was 81 years old and did not need a years-long court proceeding as the backdrop to the end of her life, but it meant we had standing. It meant we were not powerless. More importantly, I had done one other thing. About 3 weeks before Marcus sent those texts, I had a long conversation with my grandmother about the account structure. Not because I had proof of anything. I didn't. but because I was uneasy and she had raised me to act on unease rather than wait for certainty. We had talked with Daniel together, and my grandmother had made several adjustments to the account, added a transaction notification system, lowered the threshold for what Marcus could authorize without a secondary confirmation from her directly, and, this is the part that mattered most, moved the bulk of the cash reserve into a separate account that Marcus had no access to whatsoever. The amount he had taken was real, and it was significant, and it was absolutely going to be addressed. But it was not everything, not even close. Dana's voicemail mentioned, getting settled. I thought about that phrase while I was making coffee that morning. I thought about the security deposit on whatever place they had rented, the furniture they had probably already started looking at, the Scottsdale lifestyle they had built an entire future around in their heads, the one that had seemed fully funded as of Friday afternoon. I wondered how the numbers were looking now. I didn't have to wonder long. My brother called me at 11:15 that morning. He had stopped texting. "I need to talk to you," he said. "I'm listening." He started with the version of events where he was the reasonable one. He said that my grandmother had always intended for the family to benefit from the account eventually. He said that he and Dana were under enormous financial pressure and that this wasn't some spontaneous decision, that they had thought about it for a long time. He said that I was being rigid and that family didn't operate like a legal contract. He said a lot of things that I think he'd been telling himself for years in order to make the plan feel acceptable. I let him finish. Then I said, "Marcus, the account you pulled from covered about 30% of what you thought it did. The rest was restructured 3 weeks ago." Silence. Daniel has already filed the preliminary paperwork. Whether this becomes a formal legal proceeding or whether we find a resolution that doesn't involve that, that's a decision you and Dana need to make in the next 48 hours. The silence stretched out long enough that I checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "You moved the money," he said finally. "Grandma moved the money. With Daniel's help. It's her money, Marcus." "How long have you been planning this?" It was an interesting question, and I thought about it honestly before I answered. "I don't think I was planning anything," I said. "I was just paying attention." He hung up. "I'm going to tell you about the part that doesn't feel satisfying, because I think it's important, and because the comment sections of videos like this one always want the clean ending, the full redemption, or the full exile. And real life is usually something messier than either. My brother and Dana did not stay in Scottsdale. The finances simply didn't work without the cushion they had anticipated, and whatever they had told themselves about the future became very difficult to sustain in the face of an actual spreadsheet. They came back to the state within 6 weeks. The legal situation was resolved through a formal repayment agreement. Daniel handled it. My grandmother did not forgive the debt. She was very clear about that, not out of cruelty, but out of the same practical clarity she had brought to the account binder, to the color-coded tabs, to every conversation she had ever had about money. "Forgiveness is for the heart," she told me once, when I asked her how she was doing with all of it. "This is a contract." Marcus made the first payment on time. I don't know how I feel about that. I think I'm still deciding. What I do know is what changed in me during those weeks, something I had been holding at arm's length, the knowledge of who my brother had let himself become. The slow-motion grief of watching a person choose convenience over integrity over and over until it was simply their shape. I had to stop holding it away and just hold it. It was heavy, and it didn't get lighter. But there was something else on the other side of it, which was the clarity of not pretending anymore. My grandmother is still at the window on Saturday mornings. The garden is still there. The binder is still in the kitchen cabinet, updated now, with new tabs. When I visit her, we drink tea, and she tells me what she's been reading, and I tell her about work, and sometimes we talk about Marcus, and sometimes we don't. She seems okay. More than okay, actually. There is a particular kind of peace that comes to people who have been tested in exactly the way they prepared for, and she has it. She built her whole life around the idea that resources matter and that protecting them is not greed. It is love. Love for the future. Love for herself. Love for whoever comes after and inherits something solid instead of something already spent. I think about what she said to me the morning I called the bank, after I told her everything and she had absorbed it in that quiet way of hers. She looked at me and she said, "I'm glad you were paying attention." I'm glad I was too. There is something I want to say to anyone watching this who has a version of Marcus in their own family. Someone who looks at what you've built and does the quiet math of when they'll have access to it. The thing that makes these situations so hard is not that the person is a stranger. It's that they know exactly which version of you to appeal to, which hopes to invoke, which fears to press. They know where the side door is because they helped build the house. But here's what I've learned. Protecting yourself from someone like that is not a betrayal of the relationship. It is the most honest thing you can do. It says, I see you clearly. I am not going to pretend this is something it isn't. My grandmother taught me that, not in a single conversation, but in 40 years of watching her live by it. The frost came 2 weeks after all of this. I was back in her garden, pulling out the last of the summer annuals, and she was at the window with her tea. She tapped on the glass and pointed to a corner of the bed I'd missed. I went over and cleared it. Cold soil, clean edges, ready for whatever comes next. That felt about right.